Hello and welcome to Transforming Worlds. In this episode, I speak with Virginie Servant-Miklos, who's an educator, researcher, and activist, currently working as an assistant professor in the Department of Clinical Psychology at the Erasmus School of Social and Behavioural Sciences. Genie is also the founder of FairFight, which is an international foundation that empowers women, and an associate member of the Club of Rome. She recently published a book called Pedagogies of Collapse, which is the reason I traveled to Rotterdam to meet with her in person and have an in-depth conversation about her own transformation, the existential conundrum that we are currently in, and what we can do as we travel through these difficult and trying times. Which is the reason why I traveled to Rotterdam to speak with her about the existential conundrum that we are in, and the systemic collapse that is now at the point of being inevitable. How will we navigate through this, and what do we need in order to thrive? Finally, and not to be missed, we talk about her upcoming book, which is about sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and not to be missed, to be published later this year. Join me in an amazing conversation, which I hope you'll enjoy as much as I did. Hello and welcome, Genie, to Transforming Worlds. How are you today, and what is transforming in your world right now?
Well, I'm doing actually quite good today, except for the Dutch weather, where I do remember in my childhood that around this time of year it was ice skating and snow, and now some 35 years later it's rain and wind.
Usually for people who work in the areas of transformation and transformation design, what triggers us to do the work we do is a sense of discomfort. What led you to work in the area you work in today?
Well, that is a long story. I am someone who has been through multiple personal transformations, responding to crisis points in my life, and with a willingness to make uncomfortable changes in my worldview and then in the actions that I take as a consequence of that worldview.
Yes.
I grew up in a conservative family. My grandparents, my parents, we have a large Catholic family, so my whole family, I grew up going to church. My father always voted for right-wing parties. The discourse was one of authoritarian patriarchy. My grandfather was kind of the patriarch. My grandmother was very religious, very submissive. Both my grandmothers were very religious, kind of accepting the way things were in the traditional working class kind of environments. My grandmother was a factory worker in northern France. And from that worldview, there was a certain perspective on the world which was dominated by Judeo-Christian values. So I did grow up with the idea that you had to love thy neighbor, but in a very, not in the sense of collective solidarity, more in the sense of private charity. And I did grow up with the idea that it was a good thing to do to care for poor people, but with a very condescending view on poor people. My aunt was a nun who, her order had a charity in Togo. It's Order of the Augustine Nuns. And so my father was active within an organization which was a kind of Catholic development fund of some kind. So we were active in having an idea of making the world better. So I did grow up with this idea that you are on this earth to help make the world better, but the worldview about how that should be done was a very peculiar one, in which we never talked about the economic system, we never talked about class, we never talked about colonialism or any of these things. It was strictly viewed within Christian charity. And so my first forays into trying to change the world were done through this lens of Christian charity. I went to volunteer in Togo with my aunt's Augustine Sisters convent hospital in Dapang in Togo. And I had a crisis of faith while I was in Togo. I used to go to church of my own volition in university. So it wasn't like my parents were forcing me to go to church anymore. But then in Togo, I don't know, I saw children with AIDS and bishops living in mansions. And I thought, if there's a God, this is surely not the order of things that he intends or she intends. And I left the Catholic Church there and then, and was kind of left with a desire to change the world that had no shape or meaning anymore, because it wasn't through these like traditional conservative worldview that I'd grown up with. And there began a long journey to make sense of the world as I was seeing it. And that journey led me all the way to a university through meandering through missions in Vietnam and working for very wealthy people in Singapore, and doing all kinds of strange things, getting very lost along the way. I went through depression, I went through completely being alienated from myself, my family, from everything that I knew. I got very lost and ended up in a Danish university opposite a professor of critical pedagogy who in 4 hours basically helped me to reshape my worldview and to understand, oh, yeah, by the way, there's an economic system and it works in a certain way. Of course, I had some idea of Karl Marx, but this was really the moment that it clicked and that I realized the importance of class, the importance of language, the importance of structures in defining how certain positions end up in the world. Understanding poverty in a very different way than I had in like the Christian frame of reference, the kind of conservative, what I now recognize in hindsight as deficit theory, the idea that the poor are poor because of some kind of moral deficit, which is inherent, for instance, in certain Protestant religious doctrines, that God has pre-selected you, and if you're wealthy and successful, it's a sign that God has chosen you. It's like one of the core tenets of Protestant.
Oh dear.
I mean, Max Weber wrote about that in his famous book about the Protestant ethic, right?
Yes.
So to move away from that and to look at it in terms of structures really, one, set me at odds with my whole family, and two, meant I had to start a whole new life journey, which led me to become an academic and to work in the field of education. And then another personal crisis came during COVID, when I realized that the academic system itself is very diseased and very sick, and that even though I still agree with a lot of the theoretical insights that are given by the academic world, the way it translates into real life doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't lead, at least anymore, to real material progress for the people who need it the most. That academics are kind of stuck in a bubble of very complex theory and vocabulary. And when, let's say, for lack of a better word, ordinary people look at that, they don't understand it. And not only do they not understand it, but they feel left out. It's like these people with their very complex vocabulary and their feeling of morals and intellectual superiority, they're not my people. They're not speaking my language. Why should I support them? And so you see this, like, I saw this rift between the world I'd grown up in, even though my grandma was the last properly working class, generation in my family. Yeah. But she brought with her that workers' world, the factory world, even though she was very critical of it. And to see that rift between that and people who had grown and evolved in these kind of left-wing progressive bubbles. And I was thinking, this is why populist movements, far-right movements are so popular. And so since COVID, I have redirected my work to focusing on how can we reconnect with, in my case, the people in Rotterdam South. So I live and work in Rotterdam, working with the people who keep this country going by driving the trucks, by clearing our trash, by cutting hair, putting food on the supermarket shelves, growing the food. So how can we reconnect with these people? All of this within the context of environmental and societal economic collapse. So yeah, that's a long story. I did warn you, it was a long story. But those are like the two key shifts.
Right, Ginie, but we always knew you're a pioneer. We always knew that you're someone who, and your story is so interesting in this sense that it shows us that you've gone through these phases in a very immersive way, very visceral, very, very embodied, and now you can help us look at that within ourselves, within our systems that we're a part of, and see, perhaps because of the somewhat tragic experiences that you've had, in any case, big trials to your own resilience and to your own sort of personal drive. Now you're able to confront us with the trials that are in front of us, that are almost, everything collapsing around us. It's almost inevitable that at some point we're going to have to face these facts. So you talk about structures, and structures are very important when we talk about transformation, because the etymology already says it: trans, across, formation, structures, right? So structures break, and we need to break through in order to make that transformation happen. In your latest book, which is sold out, Pedagogies of Collapse, you go deeply into that we have to unlearn in order to learn and appreciate things in a different way, very much through understanding, which is something that from a knowledge point of view we're able to do, but without that rigor that you've just discussed, without that dogma, and much more linking to our sense-making capabilities. So talk to us about what led you to write the book.
So I had been, I think, already 10 years in an academic career and environments. I tried to do everything right as an academic, focusing on producing high quality research in high impact journals, first author papers, getting my PhD cum laude, then getting a postdoc in sustainability education. So I did everything right. And then COVID came, and I had this striking realization, as I had just finished a postdoc on sustainability education, which was the first time I really confronted myself with the state of the world. And I had this striking realization when COVID hit that it's actually happening now. This is not something that's happening in 50 years. The collapse has already started. And then I realized it makes no sense to be dedicating my time and energy to writing complex academic papers that no one will read, no one cares about, and that make no impact whatsoever, despite the impact factor on the journals. And it was a moment where I became quite deeply depressed around that time of COVID. And a lot of my depression was related to a feeling that the world I knew or thought I knew wasn't actually the world as it was. And feeling very alone in grappling with that. I got really immersed in the work of the French collapsologists, a lot of whom are engineers. So this was all numbers and data and physics and talking about energy and really mathematical concepts and looking at that science. It wasn't driven by an ideological worldview. Someone like Jean-Marc Jancovici explains in very simple terms just the physics of our predicament, and that really speaks to me as like deep down a very nerdy person. I read. Don't always understand, but read like Brian Greene and Stephen Hawking for fun. And it really spoke to me, that just mathematical understanding of our predicament. And I felt like I was seeing something that I had a very hard time sharing with colleagues within the social sciences and humanities, who were flying off on these theories of object-oriented ontologies and these kinds of weird philosophical abstractions. And I was like, no, can we go back and talk about physics and energy, please?
Yes.
And like feeling that isolation. I had a therapist at the time, which was helping me through it. And I think, more of us need to have good therapists. And she said, well, just grab a pen and start writing something, damn it. And don't do it because you want to publish it, just write. And so I grabbed a metaphoric pen, since it was I had this writing software on it's like a black screen with nothing else. And then I just started writing, and then I just was like, all the things. I want to say all the things. And the pledge I made to myself with Pedagogies of Collapse is that I didn't do the referencing until the end.
Oh, right.
So there were no references in the book until afterwards. I went back and fact checked everything and did the first chapter has 149 references. I went back and did that afterwards because I was like, I don't want to get caught up in this academic thinking loop. So it's like, you have a story to tell that story, and tell the story without any sense of shame or any sense of like, this is not how I'm supposed to write. No, just tell the story you have to tell.
Yes.
Base it on your own life experience. I'm so inspired, of course, by Simone de Beauvoir, who's my ultimate muse and inspiration, and the way she wrote her novels. So I tried to bring like the novel writing qualities that I so admire in Ursula Le Guin, in Simone de Beauvoir, but into a nonfiction work.
Yes.
And basing it in an autobiographic style. And so I basically practice sociological imagination on myself. How can I relate my personal experience to broader things that I see happening out in the world, and do it in a way where my experience is relevant to other people?
Yes.
And I did that by staying honest. I admit a lot of mistakes that I've made in the book.
No,
and like,
your book is brilliant precisely for that, because reality is almost more fictional than fiction these days. So, and you bring this radical, raw honesty to it, which actually causes the reader to feel a lot of resonance and a lot of recognition. We don't necessarily have to agree with every statement, but at least for once, someone is talking about how it really feels and how it really is, instead of focusing, as you say, on argumentative logic, on peer validation. No, the validation is our own feelings, and that really comes across that, because every one of us at some level or other is feeling that there is something amiss, that there is something that is asynchronous with our livelihood, with our life, with our vitality. And you talk about this asynchronicity quite brilliantly, and very much in your own authentic style, which is, I think, also one of the reasons why the book is really gaining such a following, really.
I think so. I think the existential tone is not one that we're very used to. So in most progressive literature and deep ecology literature has focused on a more structural, you know, some of it postmodern, some of it with more Marxist undertones. But for some reason, existentialism, well, for a lot of reasons I can think of, existentialism has kind of fallen out of fashion. When I fell in love with existentialism about a decade ago, some colleagues from the philosophy department were like, why are you reading this stuff? Like, who cares about existentialism?
That was old, yeah.
But my first forays into existentialism were some of Simone de Beauvoir's novels. And then I got into Kierkegaard and Heidegger. I know, lots of problems with Heidegger.
Yes, of course.
Lots of problems with Heidegger. But then I got into Sartre, and a lot through the novel form.
Yes.
And it was only after getting to grips with, for instance, I'm not sure what the translation, because I read them in French, but the Woman Broken by Simone de Beauvoir, The Mandarins, She Came to Stay, Sartre's plays. So I read his very, not scary, but kind of disillusioning play on, I can't remember what it's called in English, the one about no need for a grill, hell is others.
I don't know the name.
I think it's called The Others in French.
I will check it up.
And so all that existential literature, which it kind of brought up the same questions as I was confronted with when I was a practicing Catholic, of like, what is the meaning of being here? Why am I alive? And what I wrote in the book, and which I still mean, is if, you know, Catholic religion gave a quite definite answer to that.
Yes.
And when you take that away, it is both liberating and terrifying.
Yes. And everything crumbles.
Yeah. Yeah. But I really resonated with Milan Kundera and the unbearable lightness of being.
Yes.
And for a while, yes, I got very lost and alienated, and my own world collapsed a few times. So I think that's also why I'm more comfortable in dealing and coping and talking about the world in general, civilizational, material collapse. And here I want to like make a little addendum to your point about the validity of our feelings. Yes, but and also the material physical reality, which doesn't care about our feelings. And that is something that I do talk about in the book. When we focus purely on validation, we miss the point about there are material realities like you need to eat.
For sure. No, and you know what? That's like it's all interconnected, of course. That's why physics becomes so important in your work, because if we see ourselves materially, then we disconnect from our feelings as well. But at the same time, sooner or later, the feelings are going to come back and give us a lovely feedback loop that we need in order to re-engage with that materiality.
And that is where I discovered Merleau-Ponty, the founder of existential phenomenology, together with Simone de Beauvoir.
Yes.
Because if you read Jean-Paul Sartre or early phenomenologists like even Kierkegaard or Husserl, which all, like, as I said, all the idiocratic syntax of dead Danes and Germans, dear Lord, don't recommend reading this. Not good Christmas reading. But I started to grapple with the work of Merleau-Ponty. And again, I do not recommend reading his book because it's completely unintelligible, especially the English translation is rather poor. But what they did do, and what Simone de Beauvoir really reckons with in her novels, for those who are interested in reading something actually accessible, like The Mandarins or She Came to Stay, is the importance of the physicality of the body.
Yes.
In producing feelings, experience.
That's right.
And that to me was like, yes, this is the existentialism I want. An existentialism that is like grounded in, I have a body and this body is made up of atoms, and these atoms, you know, answer to the same laws of physics as this table and the chairs we're sitting on, and we have to reckon with that. And before I wrote Pedagogies of Collapse, I wrote an essay. It's unfortunately not open access, but I can share it with people who want it. It was called The Love at the End of the World.
Okay.
And The Love at the End of the World, it's a more philosophical piece. It's my most philosophical work. And I tried to produce an existential environmental ethics because I didn't like the way deep ecology was going. And it was a question that you and I discussed before we started this recording about what is special about humans.
Yes.
And I tried to reconcile the existential proposition that there is something particular about the human experience, the political part, the past, future, capacity to envision collective worlds that humans can bring to the fore, and moral responsibility.
Yes.
Because I said in that essay that one of the acts of bad faith I see in deep ecology is this idea that we should take as seriously the intentions of bacteria and molecules, and even worse in object-oriented ontology, you know, my laptop.
Yes.
But the fact remains that we're all hypocrites in this regard, because if you get a bacterial infection, you are going to take antibiotics and you're not going to think about it, or you'll give it to your child. We're still in Holland, but this is true. But I wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for sure. Medicine. Of course. I used to get chronic strep throat infections, and so you cannot both seriously say, we need to take the intentions of all living and non-living things equally seriously, and then just casually take antibiotics and kill all the bacteria. At some point, you draw lines, and so what I say is, all life is metabolism. Metabolism means destroying something in order to release its energy in order to. I used to teach big history, and in big history, based on David Christian's work, there's a whole chapter on the origins of life, and what we define as life. There are 7 characteristics, but one of them is metabolism. Right. And so you cannot be alive without metabolism, and that means you have to accept that the process of creation is also one of destruction. Yes. So it's about how do we do that responsibly, rather than this.
So let's get to that, to the core of that. So when you talk about morals, what do you mean in this context, especially in relation to life?
Yeah, so this is where this was one of my deepest forays into ethics. And I based myself on a book called The Ethics of Ambiguity, which is written by Simone de Beauvoir, which is for me one of the masterworks of philosophy of the 20th century. It is also the only existential book that is written in plain French. So it's actually understandable. And she gave a very strong philosophical argument as to why freedom is the ultimate ethical value. And for her, that was based on I'm going to try and explain very simply the existential premise. The existential premise is that having a consciousness, being a human, is having choice. Now, some will argue it's not really, Daniel Dennett, all that stuff. Yeah, but okay, your perception is that you have choice. So understand the critique is that it's merely an illusion, but whatever. I'm going to stay with at the phenomenological level here.
Yes.
I experience myself as though I have choice. And that choice is actually not limited. And what I give to my students to read to make that point is Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. Because here is a man who was put into a concentration camp, which is, having read the book, possibly the worst human experience I could possibly think of.
Hard to get through the first part of the book because of that, yes.
And still, he gave himself the choice about how to experience that. So that is like the core existential premise, is that under all circumstances, the consciousness is freedom to choose. But at the same time, there are certain conditions that make that choice possible or not. So the older existentialists like Heidegger and Sachs were like, no, we're free and it's inauthentic. Anything that tells you that you're not free is inauthenticity. And then Simone de Beauvoir comes in and goes, wait, guys, are you really saying that someone who's a slave or someone who lives in a harem has meaningful choice? No. So the condition in practice for freedom is that we're liberated from certain structures, for want of a better word. And that is why she was a committed feminist and anti-colonial activist her whole later adult life. And I've really taken that on board about, okay, so let's agree that the principle for an ethics is that you have a choice. But then she adds a twist, which is you can only be fully human if you create the conditions for as many other people to have freedom as possible. And the justification she gives for that, in more philosophically difficult terms, but basically it boils down to, I need you to look at me as a free person and tell me that you see me as fully human, and you can't do that unless you're free. And so we need each other's freedom to recognize each other as human. And so that is like the foundation of her entire ethics, is you need people to be free in order for you to be free yourself. And I took that and said, what does that look like in a world in civilizational collapse? Because she never considered the possibility. And I said, okay, there are a few things. And one is you can't have that freedom of choice or consciousness if your body is a wreck because it is destroyed by chemical pollution and you have cancer and chronic inflammation and all of that. Or you're starving, or you're being
you have
shelled.
Some distraction.
You're being shelled by Russian missiles or whatever. So that is the first condition. And the second is I really tried to look at, so she says, one of our moral necessities is to not close the future, so that choice is still possible in the future. But if we make ourselves extinct, that is a limit situation from which there's no going back.
Yeah.
And so we have an ethical duty to make sure that the future is still open. And thirdly, to that critical point about, oh yes, but this is an anthropocentric and like you're once again human supremacy, etc. It's the shared life world. We share this world with other living creatures, and we still have a special position from the vantage point of the experience of human consciousness, but that gives us a responsibility to make sure that our shared life world is passed down through time. Not forever, because the planet will die at some point and humanity will die, and we're not going to upload our consciousness into silicon based, no, that's not going to happen. We're not going to go and shoot off into no, I don't believe that. So eventually, whether in 100 years or in 20 million years or longer, there won't be humans around anymore. But for now, we have a possibility and a responsibility to make sure that we have a shared life world to pass on as much as possible.
Yes.
And that includes all the things that live in that shared life world. And so I think that without falling into what I call, or what others also have called, the flat ontologies of deep ecology, that we can rescue an ethical, environmental morality that places human responsibility at the heart of it.
And which is ultimately very simple. I mean, someone you may not know is the late Herbert Simon. Herbert Simon was a designer, and he was the head of the Carnegie Mellon School of Design. And he authored my favorite definition of my own profession, design. And he got into lots of trouble. You know, you would have gotten along very well, I think. And he said, everyone is a designer. That's already like, whoa, for such an elitist profession. Everyone is a designer who devises courses of action to change existing conditions into preferred ones. And I always paraphrase him by saying, you design when you transform existing conditions into preferred ones, which obviously necessitates the question, preferred for whom? But then people said, why are you saying this? And by this definition, then, for example, a fireman is a designer because building in flames, building no longer in flames, he turned existing conditions into preferred ones. And of course, a pedagogist, a teacher, is a designer. And he said, well, of course, yes, we all are. We all are co-participating to this. And this ethical, this moral imperative is very, very simple. It's about everything that is conducive to life. And how long that lasts is essentially none of our business, but we shouldn't be getting in the way. So it's very similar, and mirroring back to what you just said.
And I would be cautious with we shouldn't be getting in the way, because one of the narratives that I really try and push back against is humans are the virus narratives, with this idea that, this Gaia theory, James Lovelock kind of idea that the Earth can only hold about 500,000 people. It's like, okay, so what do we do with the 7.5 billion others? And I raised in that essay, and also in Pedagogies of Collapse, the risk of ecofascism and the risk of preserving the planet at the expense of the people who are on it. So through my existential lens, I really tried to reconcile caring for life on Earth with centering the beauty of human experience in all its richness, in all its diversity, in all the amazing feat that is human consciousness. And that is not to say that, spiders don't have some form of consciousness or bacteria or something like that, but I wanted to embrace the existential premise that there is something truly remarkable about human consciousness, and the responsibility that we have to make sure it doesn't die out in the next 100 years. And for that, we need all life on Earth is part of the human experience and consciousness. And it is on those grounds, in which I recognize a little bit of my Christian upbringing, but it is on those grounds that I put forward this fight. And there is an extra condition added to that. When you read authors like Donna Haraway and people who are in the deep ecology movement, you have the impression that all you have to do is just wait for capitalism to collapse, and then afterwards we can roll in the mud with the other creatures and build things in the ruins of capitalism, as Anna Tsing said. And I'm like, wait, but there's people that are going to get caught in the collapse of capitalism, and I've seen it firsthand from my work in southern African countries, Zimbabwe, Zambia. Yeah. And we can't just let them go and go like, oh, too bad, well, we'll see you at the end of capitalism, bye, we'll see you in the ruins and rebuild from there. No, there's an ethical imperative to do something to mitigate, soften, hold people by the hand,
yes,
including each other and ourselves through this awful collapse, which I see now as kind of inevitable. We could have taken much better steps to mitigate it 30 years ago, 40 years ago. We missed that boat, and now it's going to be nasty. We still, and I wrote this in Pedagogies of Collapse, and I still think we have a choice between controlled demolition and uncontrolled collapse. And every day we seem to be making the choice to go towards uncontrolled collapse, but we can't just give up. It's a position of a luxury to be able to despair and go, there's nothing I can do. So see you on the other side of collapse.
So
bye.
Let's get into object-subject. How does that connect to what you're telling us and the narratives that we seem to have believed?
That's a complicated one. Because that transcends the kind of traditional political narratives. Within the progressive side, people who are more on the Marxist side of things have an almost deterministic view which is very object-based. You know, the structures are
Rigid,
objective, etc. And then you have the more postmodern view in which everything is subjective. And I try and intersect at the two by saying, someone came to me at a book presentation and was like, you have a very materialist analysis of the education system. I'm like, yes, so it's grounded in the philosophical, physics, energy, surplus. Let's talk about production. But I'm quite John Stuart Mill in the sense of like, okay, there are objective conditions under which these structures are produced. But then how we relate to that, what we do with that, that is like the phenomenological, to use a dirty philosophical word. That's like where the subjectivity comes in and the choice that we apply to this.
And the concept of agency. Indeed.
Yes, absolutely. So there are some things, the laws of physics, which no amount of postmodern analysis will change the fact that, you know, there's only a certain way in which you can accelerate a vehicle, and that puts some limits into how much efficiency gains you can have. If you build a vehicle that is a tank, it doesn't matter that it's electric, it's still going to consume a lot of resources.
Right.
If you want to switch everything to hydrogen, you're going to have to double the amount of electricity that you need to produce in order for that to happen. If you want to keep growing at 3% per year, you're going to double the amount of stuff that is produced in 20 years.
Right.
That's just maths.
Yes.
And at the same time, there's also the subjective perspective about how we relate to these facts. So I really try and strike a balance between those two to always remind people of basic facts of physics and maths and science, and also our capacity to relate subjectively to that. And that puts me in a very uncomfortable position. So I've got my engineering colleagues who are kind of stuck in the world of facts and almost disregard the subjective part. And then I've got my colleagues in the humanities who are stuck in this like world of what I called in the book like paranoid schizoid splitting.
Yes.
In which everything capitalism is bad and indigenous people good, and disregard basic objective facts like infant mortality before the Industrial Revolution, or how many women died in childbirth before modern medicine. So it's a very uncomfortable position to try and be at the crossroads of these worlds, because I think as a society we've gone just towards a paranoid schizoid splitting on a vast scale, with the people who believe in what I called phallic technomagic as a solution to everything, and more growth and more capitalism will solve the capitalism problem, more technology will solve the technology problem, and then the people who are like, all capitalism and technology is bad and everything was better before the Industrial Revolution. And trying to build a narrative that's neither of these is very challenging.
How's that on an average day for you? Because for me, from my profession, I engage playfully, I engage creatively, and it said creativity loves constraints. So the more constraints there are, the more playfulness you engage. How do you go about it?
I remain as an unapologetically undisciplined maverick. I refuse to be sucked into disciplinary practices, and I am okay with confrontation. So I'm okay with respectfully, in a dialogical manner, not agreeing, not falling into belonging in groupthink. And I think that's also because of my history as someone who, I think I counted 26 times or something in my life. So moving between and not trying to show a badge of belonging to any particular creed or tribe. Also from my experience of walking away from the Catholic Church, I said there's way too many of these ways of thinking that behave like cults.
Yes.
And that is as much the Elon Musk bro cult as it is the social justice kind of racial and environmental justice movements also behave like cults.
Well, it seems to be sort of two sides of the same coin. They're both obsessed with labels, with rigidity, with ist. You know, this is the way things are and no other way. Absolute truth, as if that existed. It's dynamic. It's phenomenological, as you've said.
As I said in the book, I think this is a trauma reflex. And had a deep dive with a friend of mine who's a trauma specialist, Pam Armitage from Canada. We had a deep dive into, I did 6 months of trauma specialization with her.
Okay.
And I read Bessa van der Kolk, I read Gabor Mate, I read Pete Walker, and then I realized, wow, I think we're engaged in like trauma reflexes on a societal scale. And what I see, for instance, in the Elon Musk bro cult is a flight reflex. Let's run away to Mars. let's all get on rocket ships and leave this planet. This like flight from our condition through technological progress. And what I see in social movements is a fight reflex. It's this desire to hurt people as a payback for the trauma and pain inflicted. And how I see this is that they're less interested in challenging the people that are actually causing their issues. Like they're less interested in attacking people, let's say, on the right, or and they're more interested in hurting people that care, but that are a bit clumsy with their words or that make mistakes. So this cancel culture, you mostly see it within the progressive bubble, not outside of it. And I think that comes from a desire to hurt as like a fight reflex, a payback for this trauma. They just want to inflict some pain on someone. And you inflict way more pain on someone that cares than someone who doesn't. You know, I was doing a book talk in Denmark at a Roskilde University, and I saw graffitied on the walls the name of the rector and the head of the board, I think, and like, these are genocidal, racist fascists. And I was like, I know at least the rector quite well, who is anything but a genocidal, racist fascist. But the point wasn't to make a serious point, but to hurt.
Yes. And do you see freeze and fawn? Do you see those responses within the corporate world, within the capitalistic establishment?
Yeah, so I mean, the freeze response is all around us. So many of my students I see, upon receiving this information about the true state of the world, fall into what René Lertzman called apathy, which is not a lack of caring, but too much caring that has no place to go. So even I catch myself in a freeze response. I mean, since the election, the second election of Donald Trump, I can't read the New York Times anymore. I find it very, and I see that I'm not the only one. A lot of people have a really hard time engaging now again, and seeing where politics is heading in Holland, in France. It's really hard to keep at it. So the freeze response is, I think, almost our default response, and the fight, flight are like the responses that branch out of that. And I think the fawn response I see in this kind of groupthink, unwillingness to challenge, like, let's all get behind these ideologies, these ideas that are not actually serving progress, that are not actually having tangible, measurable outcomes in the lives of people who are being impacted by collapse. I'm going to say something very controversial, which is, I think, going to make a lot of people upset with me, but there was a climate march here in November, just before the last Dutch elections. It was the largest climate march ever organized in the Netherlands. There were 85,000 people marching there, and I was in Amsterdam marching along with them, and Greta Thunberg was one of the invited speakers. The vast majority of the people who were there were either non-political or not very politically active. At least they were not within that leftist bubble, which was great. You want to get out, like, we are not going to win this fight with just, you and whose army. We're not going to win this with just left-wing academics. Aldous Huxley wrote very presciently about that in Brave New World. They tried an island with only alphas. It didn't work. So we're not going to win and end racist, colonial, gendered oppression with just left-wing academics. It's not going to work. So I was very hopeful coming into this march. And then after the march, when Greta Thunberg got on the stage, this not only turned into a discussion about Palestine, but it gave the feeling to people who were there that if you couldn't understand the link between Palestine and climate, you were dumb. And of course, if you're an academic and you are very comfortable with words like intersectionality and climate justice and all of that, then of course it makes perfect sense. But if you're not, and you're kind of being given the impression that to belong to the climate movement, you have to understand this, then you're like, okay, then I won't belong to the climate. And the next day on my social media feed, I saw all these prominent figures in the transitions going, I'm done with the climate movement. And that moment I said, we've lost the election. And lo and behold, the far right swept the floor with all of us. And I'm not saying that was the cause, but I saw this and I was like, this is a symptom of what is going on right now. And this is not looking good.
How might we resolve this conundrum? So there has to be a way out, right? There's a maze that we're all sort of caught in, and there's got to be a way to get out on the other side. How do we do that? First, by recognizing collapse, so stepping out of denial, which you explain quite beautifully through the lens of grief. And then what?
Well, reckoning with our own trauma is a first step. As I said in the book, we are all, because of the system we grew up in, and I particularly blame nuclear families for this, and it's not the fault of the parents. I have a child myself, particularly through COVID, that was super traumatic. Being locked at home with a 2-year-old while dealing with a chronic pain condition for which I could no longer get treatment because no one could go see a physio was deeply distressing experience. But we have all been through what Gabor Mate called small t trauma. I do not believe that the nuclear family is the natural or evolutionary sound way to raise a family. There's ample evidence that, it takes a village to raise a child, and yet it is one of the big things, the bourgeois values that Simone de Beauvoir talked about, is that there's a mother, father, and that's all you need to raise a family, which of course then means the mother does most of the labor associated with the childcare in most of the world. But the point is, even with the best of intentions, with the most progressive families where the labor is equally shared, children need tribes. And so there will always be some emptiness, some longing, some feeling that something's missing, some lack of human connection that is being drowned in this toxic waste dump of social media now. And so I saw a big shift after COVID in the amount of my students who were just basically traumatized by what just happened. And then I saw a spike in this fight reflex of these students trying to find existential meaning by joining whatever movement they could get their hands on. And it gave the impression and it gave ammunition to populist movements that these students were jumping from one cause to the other, kind of seemingly lost, trying to take anybody's fight on so that they would have something to fight for, rather than being deeply committed to the small steps, the messy process of actually changing things and taking action. Because it's way easier to go sit and graffiti "Long Live the Revolution" on a wall than to actually take the steps that you need to change things. And as a French person, I really want to talk to these students about what revolution actually looks like, because in my country we have a few experiences with revolutions and it's usually bloody, messy, and ends when a dictator takes over. So and
highly romanticized.
Completely. There's this,
which is why we get into this rabbit hole every time, right? And which is why we have this illusion that might be the way to resolve it. Whereas actually we are in a time of disillusionment, of really, as you're saying, look for the facts, look for the phenomena, look for the materiality of things, what is really happening, and then learning to reinterpret what that collapse really means. This is actually the brilliance of your work, is this invitation for us to kind of draw our own conclusions, right? To look from a different space, not from the rigidity of those mental structures, but a much more embodied, as you say, much more heart, much more belly, much more felt, but not in a romantic sense, but in a very visceral, real, embodied sense, like what the F is going on and what do we want to do about it?
Do about it. That's the very important point.
The
you have to go
again.
And do something. It is not enough to sit down and scream for revolution. For me, that is an escape from responsibility. It doesn't materially improve the lives of the people you purport to be supporting. So I always have this very nasty question about effectiveness that I do not at all subscribe, by the way, to effective altruism. I'm in fact quite opposed to a lot of their ideas, but there is a question to be asked about is the work you are doing actually materially changing the lives of people that you claim or purport to be on the side of? And that is it's a tricky question, because I have been told things like, the work I do providing education to girls in Zimbabwe and Zambia, that, oh, well, I'm not challenging capitalism because I'm putting them through the education system as it was developed by the British in the colonial period, and then helping them to get jobs, which someone literally told me giving a job to a girl in Zimbabwe is stealing it from someone else. And I said, well, what's your plan? And they said, no, we should sit around in circles and grieve together. Like, that is a very luxury position from a certain kind of demographic. These girls, they want jobs. And, someone from climate movement told me, oh, I love the climate movement space because it shows me that anti-capitalism, like there's an alternative to capitalism. And I'm like, you can sit and go in your environmental protest groups because your livelihood doesn't depend on you working 7 days a week. If you get arrested by the police, you're not getting deported. And those are immense luxury positions that were brought to you by capitalism.
Yes, and we still have the question of freedom, because Margaret Thatcher back in the day famously said there is no alternative. And believe me, she was someone to deal with such a statement. My country was at war.
Before my time, but...
Yes, but I was born in a military dictatorship, and my country was at war with Margaret Thatcher. And not as a political statement, but she really did say there is no alternative.
Oh, I'm aware. But so did Tony Blair, by the way.
Of course, and so so did Ronald Reagan on the other side of the ocean. So it's a zeitgeist thing. It's part of the unfolding that we're going through as a species. But there has to be a way, perhaps many different ways, a pluriversal way of dealing with this and having alternatives within the system, which I think is what you try and propagate with your work in Africa, and what you try to propagate with your work through pedagogies of collapse. So for the people who are reading Pedagogies of Collapse, what might be their question once they finish reading the book?
I think there are several questions. The first question I hope they come away with is, all right, what am I going to do now? So I really hope that it's a book that encourages them to try and not to fear being judged inadequate, being judged insufficiently morally perfect to do something, and to find the courage to go and, try. And I don't know what that looks like for them. That's the million questions I have for the millions of educators out there, is what does that look like for you? The burning questions that I come out of from writing that book, and which I want to address in my next book, which I start working on now, is, can we recreate a politically effective progressive movement? And it may sound like how or why is this relevant, but I do think it matters who wins elections. I do think that it's a position of luxury to be able to abandon the political sphere and leave elections to other people, because we see that it does make a difference. For instance, Zimbabwe is a dictatorship, has been the entire time, since the 1980s.
Yes.
Zambia was a relatively functioning democracy. I'll be very curious to see, they're both going through the same collapse now because of the same problem, the dry up of the Kariba Dam, which their hydro power source. But you see difference in response, in resilience between the country that is, run by a corrupt political elite, and one which is trying to work through this with very little means and very little capacity to bounce back, also because of Chinese takeover of a lot of infrastructure. But ultimately, the political process does make a difference. So that is one of my...
And what is that difference? How does it manifest?
Although I do see quite a lot of increase in certain behaviors of despair in Zambia, like drinking and drugs, the problem is significantly worse in Zimbabwe. The hopelessness. the idea that nothing can change. I mean, people are just fleeing Zimbabwe.
And what is the other side of that? So is it community and one another? Is it based on the educational system? What is the contextual component that is making that difference, do you think?
You know, one of the first acts that the new president of Zambia put in place was to make education free for all. Primary and I think secondary education also became available. Now, of course, there's all sorts of problems with that. Like suddenly you have an influx of people who weren't in school and they don't have enough teachers, et cetera, et cetera. But that does move us in the right direction. Conversely, here in the Netherlands, we're seeing the opposite movement with the Populist Party getting into power and going, let's kill off higher education because it's all left-wing elite propaganda anyways. So we do see like a very strong relationship historically between political processes and the fate of education.
We might need it to break down those structures and that rigidity. Who knows?
I've said this before in public and I wasn't immensely popular for it, but I said, you know, perhaps the universities can no longer be rescued in their current form and should be allowed to collapse so that something else can come out of that. And our job here is to already bring in the plan for what comes next so that people can as fast as possible transition, because entire, you know, thousands of people's careers and lives and all our scientific infrastructure would fall apart. And so it needs a place to go. And that's the work that I'm doing concretely here in Rotterdam with the Build Climate School, with trying to build new institutions that abolish the distinction between vocational, applied, and university education. So my central concern right now is how do we build already now the alternative so that people don't fall into a vacuum.
That's right.
And like, I don't have necessarily the answers. I have the answer that I'm working on, but I want to hear from everybody who's involved in this field. How do we already now think about what happens after? Because, okay, so now we cut 1 billion euros of funding from the universities, and then what's next? 2 billion euros? And then we shut down 1 university and then 2 universities. And it's, you know, like one bit at a time until there's just a shadow of itself left. So we must have the alternative already being worked on now. Otherwise we fall into a vacuum. And like, that's the question I really want to raise. Of course, it's a very Dutch problem in a way, but it's also a very international problem.
No, it's a very real problem because you said it, life is metamorphosis. And if I look at the design discipline went through this immense boom with this very mental concept of design thinking. And we thought, oh, if we teach you the process, then it will guarantee the outcome. Of course it doesn't. Because it's an embodied thing. It's a wisdom that is beyond the knowing. You need the knowing. Again, you know, we got to this stage of progress because we looked at things with rigor, with structure, with depth. But now we need to figure out how do we integrate that? And design is going through that very process ourselves, where we've noticed that just trying to pass on the recipe book is not going to deliver the same kind of cuisine. We need to play with ingredients. We need to smell, to taste, to try, to mix, and to be playful about that. And unless we start creating those spaces, the structure will collapse anyway. I mean, the jury's out on that one. I mean, that much is clear. As you give the beautiful, well, not beautiful, but very clear analogy of the airplane, right, and the crash landing. And I think that it's really now is the time to get all hands on deck and figure out what experiments might start conducing to those seedlings of what is coming next. Whenever there is collapse, there is emergence. But let it not become emergency.
What I'm worried about, and like a big question that I have, is how do we bring people to that point of wanting to invest in that? Yes. Whereas a lot of the reaction I'm seeing from, you know, all levels of society is a numbing, whether that's people falling into depression and burnout,
yes,
a lot of teachers,
yes,
or substance abuse. This is something I've seen very much in Southern Africa, the use of alcohol and particularly crystal meth there, or in the US, people drowning in opiates. I'm seeing like an escape, a flight from our predicament at the time where we need to find ways to confront it and get together. And that is one of like the core things that keeps me up at night, that worries me. How do we do this? How it's that talk of hope. What is hope, and how do we stop ourselves from numbing our minds to the point where we can no longer feel? Because in order to grieve, to process, and then move forward again, you need to feel. You need to feel all the hard things. And if we numb ourselves to that, we can't go through that process, and we might numb ourselves into extinction. And I'm really worried about that, like getting stuck in that despair phase. And I do think there are some practices, and including drugs, that are more helpful in processing trauma. In the book, I talked about how I use psychedelics to help me overcome my mental stuckness and my being stuck in the past and my struggles with post-traumatic stress disorder. And like psychedelics gave me a new lease of life, but I'm also very aware that those can be used and abused in all kinds of unhealthy ways, including new cults, including reinforcing narcissistic behaviors as we're seeing in Silicon Valley, including, and this is very well described by Aldous Huxley in The Doors of Perception, disconnecting you from caring about humans. So word of caution on that, but there are a lot of people doing some beautiful work on the intersection between psychedelics and ecological thinking and behavior. But ultimately, these are all part of a broader picture of how do we find the strength and courage to keep going. And that was the last chapter of Pedagogies of Collapse. Is like, I hadn't planned to include that chapter in, but so many people, every time I talk, ask me, how do you keep going? So that was a question. I was like, how do I keep going? So that's the question that I tried to answer. And the answer is sometimes I don't. I've had a really hard 6 months this year. Like, I've had really challenging personal circumstances that then intersect with, you know, the world falling apart and Donald Trump being reelected and all of. So
not by coincidence, by the way, but that's a whole other episode.
And so the personal and the global inevitably intersect.
Of course.
And I've had to relearn again. I've learned so much since the book has come out about personal resilience and how that intersect with global resilience. And that will be the topic of my next book, which I'm working on now, which is called The Left We Need: Sex, Drugs, Rock and Roll and Climate Justice for All. It's tongue-in-cheek. It's meant to be even more accessible than Pedagogies of Collapse. And I want to reckon with how do we rebuild an effective progressive movement that actually makes material, that takes into account that objective material conditions and works with that.
Yes.
While also giving us something to hope for, which is not drowned in the bad kind of drugs, but works towards different kinds of human relationships, different kinds of ways of loving, different ways of relating with our bodies, all of which don't cost CO2.
Yes. And I will quote you, paraphrase you freely here. You say something that really touched my heart. You said, the way through the collapse, there's no way out. The way through the collapse is when we start loving possibility more than we fear the collapse. And I think, and you wrote a beautiful poem, which I can also add the link to your TED talk to the show notes. I think that's really where that flame comes from, right? And sometimes we lose sight of the love for possibility because the collapse is so pressing, but it's where you re-engage every single time and get up again and have your resiliency from, which is very admirable.
I think that the rock and roll part, which is like a bit of a joke, but it's also the role of music and art and poetry, and a lot of rock and roll and metal lyrics are very poetic, by the way.
Yes, they are.
But you know, it's also the Bildung kind of underpinning of the educational methods that I'm developing.
Yes.
Bildung is about poetry, music, and all that kind of thing. Things that give life their meaning,
expression
outside of consumption and buying things as a way to generate meaning. So yes, the title Sex, Drugs, Rock and Roll is meant as tongue-in-cheek, but also I want to have a serious conversation about what are the things that actually on a fundamental human level make life if not good, because through collapse that's always going to be a bit challenging, but at least meaningful.
Yes.
And that we can do regardless of what's going on around us. And I want to finish maybe on an anecdote. I was teaching in the Bildung Climate School earlier in June, or I think, and we had a little exercise where I showed them a video about the heat waves that were striking India. It was like 50 degrees in India.
Terrible.
And one of my students was really, really almost traumatically shocked by this 10-minute video clip. And then we had a dancing, embodied dancing. It's called Intuitive Body. It's Double Skin, Double Mind, and it was taught by a professor from the Code Arts School of Performance here. Susan Tunka, I've been working with her for quite a few years. And they had to dance out this traumatic response. And at the end, we had an integration session, like talking together, and the student says to me, I can't do this, like I can't dance, I feel too guilty. And I said to her, but you know, I've been to a number of funerals in Zimbabwe and other, you know, traumatic life events. People dance at funerals. And I said, the moment you give up on dancing, you give up the very things that we wanted to fight for. And she really took that to heart and realized, like, yes, it's the fundamental thing that makes us human, this connection with beauty and art and movement and all of that. And if we can't fight for that, then there's nothing left worth fighting for. So if that was the message she got from the Bildung Climate School, we've done our job.
Oh, you certainly do your job. So tell our listeners, where can they find your work?
I have a website, which has just come online. It's educationforsocialchange.com. And there you'll find the experimental pedagogics framework they talk about in the book that they can use. They'll find my pedagogical tools, open access, including the Collapse board game, but also reference to all these pedagogies that I use and discuss, including the double skin, double mind, and where to find the people who do that. They'll find my TED Talks and my podcasts and a link to the book, which is, by the way, open access and free to download for those who want the digital version. I run a summer school for teachers every year, so it's every last week of June, first week of July, and that's a 4-week program where you can come and learn with me about how to use all these tools.
Thank you so much, Ginie, for the wonderful work that you're doing, and I hope that more people will follow it and particularly embrace it and embody it. That's what the world needs. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for giving me the space for my chaos.
We love chaos. Thank you.